And now we will talk about what a risk plan is and how to implement one. So we start with the project risk plan definition. A project risk plan is a collection of risks and actions you can take based on indicators and risk categories. A risk plan or a risk management plan consists of a list of potential project risks, their associated impacts and likelihood, and any planned action for how to address the risk if it should come up. Now you could write your risk management plan in a simple table like this. Across the top of the table you have your risk ID, which is also very important so you can track your risk later. You have your risk description, its associated rank or risk category, a description of the risk indicators, and a description of the action to be taken if the risk presents itself. Now, if you fill out these two columns, it should look like this. Risk, of course, is what we've been talking about in this whole module. It is something that the potential to cause your project to fail. An indicator is what you should be looking for to identify that you might be facing this risk. It is a description of the signs that your project is at risk. Action is what should be taken if you notice what risk your project is facing through the indicator. Now, if you remember from the previous lecture, when we talked about the impact versus likelihood metrics, so we identified three risk categories, simply called 1, 2, and 3. Risks placed in category 1 are considered a risk that should be addressed as soon as possible. They represent the most danger to your project, and these risks are placed in your project plan and associated action is usually immediate. Risks placed in category 2 are less severe but are still placed in your risk plan. These risks pose a moderate threat to your project, so any action that should be taken are planned seriously, but not to the same extent as the category 1 risk. And the category 3 risks are not planned much at all because they represent a low threat to your project. Now let's take a look at a few examples of how risk might appear in the impact versus likelihood metrics. We will use one example. In our music player app, your client will have to get copyright access to any of the content they provide to their users. So you place this in your impact versus likelihood metrics and determine that the risk of your client not getting copy access is a category 2 risk. So it's pretty high impact but on the moderate likely to happen, and it will look like this. You already have the first two columns of your risk plan done for this particular task, the risk rank and its description. An indicator that your client is not going to get copyright from the artist that they want in the app is that they are communicating this issue to you or they are showing signs that they are losing interest in the app. So appropriate action for this risk might be that you ensure that your developers deliver the product in sprints so that the client sees progress from your side. Another potential action item here is to settle any financial on the project appropriately and get guaranteed that you will be compensated for the work done. Some product owners might think it prudent to help the client get copyright access to content for the sake of the project. It helps on the scope of your position as a product owner, but sometimes actions like this will determine whether your project will live or die. And here is another example from our music player app. Your developers decide that they want to use a compression algorithm that uses a special technique to increase the loading speed of the app's content. However, this algorithm was only just conceived in the hotel room by one of your developers the night earlier and is essentially untested. The details of the algorithm aren't clear and your developers are unsure whether it would work. So you enter this into our impact versus likelihood matrix and determine that the risk of your team not being able to implement the algorithm is a category 1 risk. And it will look like this. It is highly impactful to the project and highly likely to happen. An indicator that this risk is impacting your project could be that your team has made no progress over 1 week of development. Another indicators could be that your developers tell you authoring that the work on the algorithm just isn't getting anywhere. To dampen the blow of the risk on your project, there are a few actions you can take. One would be to warn your client that the algorithm you're trying to implement is not ready and may not work. You may want to make managing expectation with your client your top priority. You could also have a backup plan if the algorithm doesn't work. In this case, you could decide with your developers that if no progress is made within 1 week, they start work on the algorithm they will use as a standard compression algorithm instead. So don't forget to tell your clients about this backup plan so they aren't left wondering what would happen if the algorithm is unsuccessful. If you do this for all the risk that you have categorized as 1 or 2 in our project, you will be much more likely to see your project succeed. However, what about the risk you don't know about? Unfortunately, you cannot plan for what you don't know. There will always be unforeseen risk in your projects. Sometimes your project success comes down to how you deal with these risks at the moment. Not to say that you shouldn't plan your project or that you shouldn't run your project by the seat of your pants. All I mean is that you're not going to be able to plan for everything. Dealing with unforeseen risk is a skill that you should develop as a product owner just as much as dealing with the foreseen risk is. What techniques to use to identify and mitigate project risks? So to mitigate project risk, we can look at a few different factors. You can create brainstorming workshops where you will identify and brainstorm risk associated with certain project and different technologies. In those sessions, you will understand who wants to own the different risks that you have and how you will have risk responses to those risks, including avoidance strategies, mitigation strategies, transferring risk, or just accepting the risk as well. You will better understand the impact and probability of each of those risks so you can assess what kind of response you need to tailor, who need to own those risks, and by what timelines.